So our speakers today from Bowser, we've got a few of them here, so I'll just go through our list a little bit. So we've got Ken Powell today. Ken is the state's WCA operations supervisor, responsible for coordinating WCA. So Ken's worked for Bowser for about 13 years. Prior to that, he administered WCA at Rice Creek Watershed District, was a private consultant, and worked as an endangered species biologist for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Ken got a BS in wildlife from University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point and an MS in biology from Kansas State. So next, David Demmer. David Demmer is Bowser's Northeast Region Wetland Specialist. He's based out of Duluth, and his work area covers the northeast corner of the state. David's been at this post for about 5 years. Prior to that, he did WCA LGU work in Cook County for 9 years. David holds a degree in geology from UMD. Began his career in the private sector as a hydrogeologist in the Intermountain West, doing environmental permitting and as exploration field geologist based out of Southwest Alaska. Interesting background, David. Ben Meyer is next. Ben is Bowser's Metro Region Wetland Specialist based out of St. Paul. His work area covers the 4 eastern metro counties. Ben's been at Bowser for about 6.5 years. Prior to that, he was a wetland consultant for 13 years, acting as an LGU in dozens of Minnesota communities, as well as conducting thousands of delineations across the upper Midwest, working on hundreds of replacement plans and other environmental documentation, such as bank plans, EAWs, and so on. So Ben's also worked for the DNR, county government, and a land surveying firm. He's a BS in biology from Northland College and an MS in soils from the U of M. And last but not least, Dennis. Dennis Rodacker is the State Wetland Mitigation Project Manager responsible for managing the Local Government Road Wetland Replacement Program, which is a mouthful. He has worked for Bowser for about 8 years. Prior to that, he was a wetland specialist for Anoka SWCD and a private consultant and soil scientist for the NRCS. Dennis has a BS in soil science from the University of Wisconsin-River Falls. So those will be our speakers today. Welcome to all the Bowser speakers, and I'll let you guys take it away. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for having us. I think it was about a year ago that we did a similar kind of presentation, and I believe I started out in that presentation spending about 10 minutes or so kind of going through Bowser's role. I'm not going to spend that amount of time again, but I would like to just talk a little bit about it for folks who maybe are not as familiar with it. So our role is to promulgate or put into effect the WCA rule and statutes. And I always look at WCA as sort of the 3-legged stool. We have the local government units which administer the act. Bowser does oversight, and DNR is the enforcement authority. Next slide. These are the some of the major things that Bowser does more specifically. We are, of course, a member of each technical evaluation panel. We administer all aspects of wetland banking. We do hear appeals of LGU decisions. We also approve wetland plans, comprehensive wetland plans. We do training. We also administer the Local Government Road Wetland Replacement Program, or LIGR work. And Dennis will talk a little bit more about that, but that's basically the program where Bowser provides wetland mitigation for certain qualifying projects conducted by local road authorities, counties, cities, and townships. And of course, we do rulemaking, which I'll talk a little bit about later on in the presentation. Next. Here's just an overview of the wetland section. So Bowser is divided into sections, and so we have just a wetland section. Les Lim is the manager, and then you got myself as the operations supervisor and Tim Smith as the mitigation supervisor. So the wetland specialists, which are regional, they work for me. So we've got, I like to refer to as the Bens out of the St. Paul office, and Alyssa Kaur is in Rochester, David up in Duluth, John Hansel is in Marshall. He's, I believe, our newest specialist, but he has been with us for several years now. Steve Hofstad, Detroit Lakes, Matt Johnson in Bemidji, and Linda and Cade in St. Cloud, technically Waite Park office, but St. Cloud is more familiar, so I just put that. On the mitigation side, we have two mitigation specialists, Kane Radel, and Kane is almost exclusively working with agricultural wetland banks, and as of now anyway, he's working primarily under a grant from the NRCS to develop wetland banks. And then John Overland has been a mitigation specialist for some time, reviewing all of the wetland bank plans. Other folks, Carol Straney, monitoring, Dennis, of course, project manager, and he'll explain a little bit more about what he does. Amy Waters is our kind of overall program assistant. And for those of you who might remember Eric Mooring, he did retire, but he is back doing a little bit of work on a contract basis. Next slide. This is just a reminder of the regions that we have, and each wetland specialist is assigned to a region. I like to emphasize this. I get a lot of inquiries from the public and other folks, and it seems like almost probably 90% of them relate back to some specific project or something regionally. So I end up kind of funneling a lot of those questions to the regional wetland specialist. So just a reminder that if you do have questions regarding WCA, I would always start with the applicable regional wetland specialists, and if for some reason you can't get a hold of them, you can come to me or others. Next slide. So here's our agenda today. Dennis is going to start off with the local government road wetland replacement program, and specifically the request for proposals that will be coming out here this month, I believe. Then David and Ben will talk about the MWPCP, which is the continuation of the Wetland Delineator Certification Program, which is now under Bowser. Then I'll come back and talk about 404 assumption and rulemaking, and a new initiative we're calling the Wisconsin-Minnesota Functional Assessment Initiative. And then finally, just a little bit on our WCA topics of the week. So that's all I had.
I guess it's me, huh? Okay. Hi, I'm Dennis Rodacker. I am the Wetland Mitigation Project Manager for the Local Government Road Wetland Replacement Program. And Colleen, you're right, that is a mouthful. Maybe just shorten it up and say I'm Dennis from the road program. What I want to cover today is mainly an RFP that we're going to be sending out here at the end of the month. And I'll go over the entire RFP, but only certain sections apply to you guys. Next slide, please, Ben. So, like I said, we're going to talk about a little bit about the program. We're going to talk about the organizational structure of the RFP, and then we'll go over our evaluation process and timelines. Next slide. So those of you that don't know, the road program is a program that is managed by Bowser through a state statute that requires Bowser to provide mitigation for local road authorities. These local road authorities, you know, cities, townships, counties, they do a road project, they impact wetlands, they require mitigation for either the WCA or for either the Corps, and we step in and provide that service for those authorities. And it works out best because, as you know, local road authorities are probably not so well suited for wetland mitigation, and they don't have the area to do these this mitigation. So we end up with a much higher quality product. Next slide, please, Ben. All right, so this RFP is broken up into a few different items. So for the road program, we have $8 million. And this $8 million is going to be specifically put out for projects. We've got the easement sign-up projects, we got third-party projects, and partnership projects. And then we have an additional $2.9 million to go out there and purchase credits from existing bank holders. Next slide, please. All right, so I'll go over a little bit of these options, and some of these are more applicable to you guys than others. The easement sign-up one, if you guys are familiar with any of our other conservation programs like RIM or CREP, this operates just like that. We go out and we purchase a conservation easement from a landowner. We basically cut him a check, they're out of the loop. We go in, we design the project, we pay for all the construction, all the vegetation establishment, vegetation maintenance over the life of the bank. We have our local SWCDs help us a great deal with the various tasks that are involved. And then in turn, we pay the SWC for their services and any reimbursement costs that are necessary. A new one that we're rolling out is a partnership agreement. We've been doing this for a couple of years and we're working out the kinks on it. But basically, a partnership agreement is where the Bowser and it's either a landowner or an entity like an LGU or an LLC or whatever, somebody that has the legal rights to a piece of land. We work together to develop a wetland bank program, and we split costs, and in turn we split credits at a predetermined amount of cost. Basically, we go in and we do the design, we develop the wetland bank application, and then we get the state and federal permits, and then the partner goes in and does the bank plan implementation, and based on the inputs of each party, we split credits at that at a certain ratio. Next slide, please. Third-party credit proposals. I think a lot of you guys are probably familiar with these. This is when there is a private banker. They're out there, they're working to develop a bank, and then they in turn sell credits to Bowser. There's a couple of caveats to this. Sometimes we get banks that are already approved, and all they're needing to do is record the easement. And it's very important that that easement is not recorded prior to the sale of the credits. It has to do with the type of bonding money that we receive. The big thing that you guys need to be aware of for third-party projects is we're having a deadline. You must be able to deposit credits no later than January 31st of 2024. So this means you've got to be already in the bank and review process, because we all know how long it takes to get these projects approved. You get your initial deposit, and now you wait for 2 years to get your hydrology release and your initial veg release. So what we're going to be asking applicants is, for one, is their prospectus, and two, is their initial review letter from the Corps. If you don't have those, it's not worth applying, because we're just going to disqualify you in that case. The upside for a banker on this is they have a guaranteed buyer, and this lowers their financial risk. This enables them to sell some credits right up front, and then they can start paying back their consultants and their contractors and so on and so forth. Our fourth option is we go out there and we just purchase credits. So these are already credits that are in the system. This gives the bankers a new type of buyer, and it does allow us to kind of close out some of these older banks that have very small amount of credits remaining. Next slide, please, Ben. All right, so location matters. We are targeting certain areas of the state based on our need for the project, for the restoration projects. This includes the easement sign up, the third party, and the partnerships. We're looking at BSAs 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. We've pretty much the far north part of the state we're taking care of through other means. We're looking to get at least one project in each BSA. Now, we don't know how many we can get. $8 million is a pretty good chunk of money that we can get these projects rolling with. So if we can get one per BSA, that'd be great. If not, we're gonna do what we can to get at least multiple in certain BSAs. Next slide, please. For the direct credit purchase, we're looking at BSAs 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. Yeah, that's all I got on that one. Next slide, please. A little bit on the site selection, kind of what we're looking for. And as consultants, you guys obviously go through this. This slide is more for our SWCDs, but just to make you aware, we're looking for partially or fully drained wetlands that have some type of drainage infrastructure, whether it's tiles, ditches, pumps, berms, whatever. And then we're looking for areas that have more than 50% of the restorable areas wetland, because then we can get the most bang for our buck. And it has to be free of other significant easements. It can already be in some type of legal agreement or some other easement that lays over the property, because our easement would then be subordinate. Next slide, please. The information for our upcoming RFP will be placed on our website. I know that this slide says 2020. It's from last year. We will update this, and you'll find fact sheets and application forms and everything you need right here at this site. And then, you know, if you can't find it or you still have questions, you can always call me. Next slide, please. All right, so the evaluation process, we're looking to launch this thing February 22nd, and we're going to keep it open for 6 weeks. And then after that, we're going to close it and go from April 7th to May 5th, where we're going to do initial screening and evaluations. After May 5th, it's going to be agency coordination and partnership meetings and evaluations, and then project selection around July 7th. Now, I know this seems like kind of a long review time, but one of the main reasons that it's going to take so long is these partnerships. When we enter into a partnership agreement, there's a lot of details that we're resolving. So there's going to be a series of meetings with these partners, and that's going to take a lot of time. And because we have to evaluate all projects together in one lump sum to determine which ones are the best value, we have to wait till the negotiations of the partnerships are complete until we can make decisions on all the other ones. Next slide, please. Okay, so onto the agricultural bank. The Ag Bank, which is managed by Kane Radell, it's a partnership between Bowser and NRCS, and the goal is to provide mitigation for agricultural producers for agricultural projects. It is a subset of the wetland of WCA's wetland banking, but the credits are limited to ag projects with degraded wetlands, and the goal is to satisfy both mitigation for both WCA and the Swamp Buster. Next slide. We're targeting the same BSAs that we are for the restoration projects, BSAs 4 through 9. Next one. And that's all I have. So if there are any questions, you can either ask them now, or you can send me an email or give me a call at your leisure. That's all I have.
I don't see any questions in the chat or raised hands, so I think we're good to keep going.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is David Demmer. Ben Meyer and myself co-coordinate the Minnesota Wetland Professional Certification Program. And, 2020 obviously was kind of an interesting year in its own right. So we would spend a few minutes and provide you a few updates of kind of what 2020 left us with the program, and then kind of what we're thinking moving forward. One thing that I do want to note is that this is an update, but especially as we get into our 2021 plans, we are certainly looking for feedback from folks, especially some key stakeholders like yourselves at WPA. So, as a follow-up, if you guys have thoughts, questions, like I said, you can ask them now after this short little presentation. Otherwise, feel free to reach out to Ben or myself, because we are looking for feedback on what we're thinking, trying to adapt into the climate right now. So the updates that we wanted to provide you guys was just kind of just a review of 2020 and the cancellations that happened, and some of the short-term policy changes that we made, especially with the continuing education credit extension. We also figure it'd be important for folks like you to hear kind of our logic with our priority of in-person training versus all virtual training. That said, we have also made some headway in providing some online training, and we do intend to continue to do that, but want to kind of give you some thoughts on how we are approaching that. And then, especially for folks who are, certified individuals, we wanted to kind of talk a little bit about the continuing education credit requests that we're seeing, some just kind of reminders of what we're looking for and some of the process related to that. And then, the big question mark there is moving forward with 2021. We are certainly well into the way of planning 2021. Obviously, there are still some pretty big unknowns that we're, tentatively planning around. And this is also an area we want to give you an update of kind of where we're going, what we're thinking, what we're considering, but then, looking for feedback from you guys. So you can go ahead, Ben. So the 2020 was, obviously the year of COVID, and, with it was actually the first full year of the program since its continuation from WDCP. We had what I would consider a pretty robust training schedule that we had planned out. It included 5 regional trainings starting right away early spring, all the way through our 2 basic classes. Those are the old 5-day classes. And it totaled 19 total training days. And we had agendas, presentations, we were all ready to go. And then, of course, COVID happened. And we saw the writing on the wall pretty early and canceled everything. And, we did hold out for some of those later courses in the year, but, obviously that didn't turn out. So as a policy then, given the fact that we lost a full year, given the fact that we lost the first full year of the program, we made a short-term policy decision to extend the current certification renewal period until December 31st, 2023. The idea there is that, of course, then you just have that additional time to get your continuing ed credits. And just as a reminder, those are 18 credits every 3 years. So, and an hour is a credit. So that was 2020. And obviously, it left us scrambling a little bit. If you go ahead, Ben, and forward. So as we were kind of thinking about how to approach, 2020, then leading into this year, we really had to make some kind of fundamental decisions about what our priorities are with the program and how we want to approach training. And, when the pandemic started happening, everybody was switching over virtually, and there was this mad scramble to produce content, to have these forums virtually, and it kind of left us wondering, well, okay, we got to recognize that some topics can be taught virtually, right? Regulatory stuff, you can teach how to determine an LGU virtually. But we also need to recognize that a large aspect of the certification program is to train field methods. We are field scientists, right? So the program made that decision that while, yes, we can shift, we can start producing some fundamental virtual material, but by extending the certification period and prioritizing to trying to push back to a time where we can get back to our field-based training is really what we wanted to work towards. So we don't know what form that's going to take, the in-person training that is, but that is our priority. And I think that's just something that we really want to make sure that we're communicating clearly with their stakeholders, is that we prioritize standing around a soil horizon, soil profile, and texturing it out as a group, making these field determinations, field calls, relying on technical field skills, and that is the priority still to this day. So that's kind of the idea behind the decisions that we've made so far. So go ahead, Ben. I did mention, and we are in the process of developing online training modules. These are kind of, if you think about our program and our core curriculum, we have the delineation skills, and which was, the 3-parameter focused that WDCP traditionally focused on. But of course, with the new program with MWPCP, we are also teaching regulation, of course, now. So there's a whole slew of new content that we need to consider. And it tends to be those regulation training, like I mentioned earlier, that can be easier taught in a virtual format. But either way, whether it's delineation or regulation, our intent is that these online modules are going to provide a foundation of the core curriculum subjects. So we focused right away some fundamental topics, the 3 parameters of wetlands, like you see there on the screen. WCA 101, which is a presentation we used to do quite routinely, like at Bowser Academy. Basic WCA decisions, so basically from boundary type up through exemptions, so not including replacement plans and banking decisions. Those 3 are now done, produced, and online. We are currently in the process of developing more modules. We have 2 in the works right now. And we do have plans to ultimately produce 9 different modules. I'll note that the ones online right now, they aren't eligible for credit. The 2 main reasons with that is that one, the content right now is they're each 10 to 20 minutes. So right now the content itself is only about 40 minutes total, so not even 1 credit. But also 2, we haven't made the shift to need to track participation and such. The WCA related online modules, however, do have quizzes at the end, do have 5 quizzes at the end, and just to kind of ensure basic comprehension of the modules. Go ahead, Ben. We wanted to just kind of, with this group, just go over the credit review request reviews, mainly because, this is the first year of the program. And, we are kind of in a different world than we thought we were going to be. And, there are definitely some non-MWPCP virtual events that have been approved for credit, such as this, that we're on here today. And, so with a lot of the events shifting online, we just kind of thought it'd be worth just kind of running through what we recommend event organizers and participants to do and keep in mind when they're registering and participating in these online events. So for the event organizers, we're still asking that you submit a credit hour determination request form prior to the event. That way, the benefit is twofold. One, you have a firm idea from us exactly how many continued ed credits that event will be worth. The other benefit then is that we can post it on our website for others to know what's going on. Well, then we're asking participants of these virtual events that they then report their participation using the credit hour reporting form. And, they don't have to all be done as one-offs. They can be all, kind of batched together and submit at the end of the year. But really one big thing that is important for everyone to know, I think, who's certified, is that we do in our policy have this maximum of 4 hours of online training that can be counted towards the CEC for that renewal period. that is a policy that has not changed. So that's definitely something important to keep in mind. Forward, please. So 2021 question mark, right? We're all kind of we're in this state where we know there are a couple knowns. For example, state employees are going to be working from home through the end of June. So we won't be having anything in person during that time. So at the earliest, we would be talking July, would be the soonest we would be anticipating any kind of in-person training. I kind of alluded to this earlier, but with the in-person training, we are putting a priority on the basic class and the exams. There is a pretty good backlog and pretty high demand right now for basic wetland training. A lot of graduates, folks now LGUs seeing, hey, this is affordable. I want to get certified. TEP members as well. So there's quite demand on that, and we want to prioritize that. We recognize that, and we want to get folks in through the basic class. And also, too, we want people who have been working on their training and education experience to take exams, whether it be the in-person or the professional exams. That is a priority for us. So the 2 basic classes that we plan on having or hope to have at the end of the year will both have exams on the last day on that Friday. And one area of feedback that we are certainly open to and looking for from stakeholders like you guys are, we want to make sure we're gauging the demand right. We're open to even thinking, well, do we need to even have the 3rd basic class? We don't know, but we're looking to for feedback from you guys. So here's what we're considering, and these last 3 points all have question marks after them, right? We are considering doing some virtual regional training in the spring, so the April and May timeframe. We are in the planning process for those right now, working on topics that would be appropriate with this method. So that is what we're thinking about for April and May. We are also considering reducing the CEC's continuing ed credits for this current renewal period down to 12. The main reason is that if you look at this, we're already into 2021 now. By the soonest we're going to be training, just with virtual, will be April, May. So we have lost a fair amount of 2021. So we are considering just doing a one-time policy to reduce our 18 to 12 continuing ed credits for this current renewal period. And then kind of on the same token, we are also looking at increasing the training hour look back for test applications back to 4 years. Currently, when you apply for a test, we look back at your training over the last 3 years. So because we effectively lost 2021, we are considering increasing that look back to accommodate an extra year. So, go ahead, Beth. So that is essentially what I've got for training. Open to field or try to field some questions right now. If folks want to reach out directly to Ben or myself, feel free to. But I don't know if there's anything in the chat or any hands raised.
I have is it recommended that we submit credit hour reporting forms as we complete each training rather than in bulk at the end of the certification period?
Yeah, it's a good question, Beth. I think that it kind of depends on if you're going to be doing any more that year. So if you just are doing the one training a year, that's all you're planning on doing. That's your plan. I think it's just fine to just do it as you get done. Sometimes it's easier just to do it when you get done. But we certainly, from an administrative side, it is always helpful just to have the one form for that one individual coming in, and we can, as long as they're all previously approved courses, then that certainly makes it easier for us administratively to process that, get your credit hours counted towards your certification.
I have another question. What other modules are in the works and will they be for credit?
At this point, we're not planning on crediting anything at this point online. That might change, but at this point, I'll say no to that part. The ones that we are in the works right now, there's classification systems. We've been working with the technical training team at Bowser and have been doing some work on classification systems, and we've revamped our old classification systems training to include hydrogeomorphic method. And so we are working on an online module for that. And then actually any day, in fact, I should be posting it by the end of the week, we will also have a WCA procedures, a WCA application procedures module going on right now. That's, of course, 5 of the 9 that we have planned. So if whoever asked that question wants to follow up, I'd be more than happy to elaborate on that.
Do these Wetland Professional Association virtual meetings count towards the 4-hour limit of online training? If they were previously live, we would have used them towards our certification.
So yes, there are a number of WPA virtual forums that have been approved. They're all listed on our website, and these can count towards that 4-hour online training.
For in-person, can you get training credit for conducting field reviews with Bowser Wetlands, excuse me, Bowser Wetland specialists who like to pontificate, discuss rules, review soils, and basically geek out about wetlands?
Well, I like that, pontificate on the rules. You must be talking about Ben, right, Jay? No, at this point, our policy is excluding TEP meetings from certification.
Can you clarify, is everyone who was certified at the program changed now due in 2023?
Is everyone who is currently certified?
Yeah, so when the program changed, is everyone now certified until 2023?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the one nice thing about us making these adjustments now is that we basically started everybody at 2020. So everybody now is 2023. So there's no staggered calendars. So that's one reason why we've been able to make this adjustment, and we're not going to have crazy schedules to have to keep track of. So yes, everybody is 2023.
And we have a comment, -1 hour point for each certification. But
yeah.
Those are all the questions I see.
Great, thanks. And again, feel free to reach out to Ben and I with questions.
All right, I'll pick up this initiative we call the Wetland or Wisconsin-Minnesota Wetland Functional Assessment Initiative. Next slide. So essentially what this is an agreement between Bowser and the Wisconsin DNR to jointly develop wetland functional assessment tools for regulatory and conservation purposes. I guess more emphasis probably on the regulatory part. Next slide. So why are we doing this? Those of you who've worked with MinRAM, it is a very old method. I believe it's 20+ years old now. Certainly there's been some advancements in wetland science since the 90s. And there's a definite need for more practical tools, at least in my opinion, for regulatory purposes. And the federal mitigation rule and policies as those evolve, there is an increased need to be a little more precise and objective in measurements of wetland functions. And this is, could be very important for Minnesota if, the 404 assumption moves forward, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Next slide. Who else is involved besides Bowser and Wisconsin DNR? We also have representatives from Minnesota DNR, or a representative from Minnesota DNR and the Pollution Control Agency are on this steering committee that we've formed for this initiative. Bowser has 2 representatives, myself and Steve Hofstede, out of the Detroit Lakes office. The intent here is for the steering committee to not do everything, but to tap subject matter experts from the different agencies to assist with different kinds of technical matters associated with the different functions of wetlands. There will also be a coordination and peer review and outreach to stakeholders, and that will be part of this effort. We're not going to be doing this in a vacuum. I think maybe in the distant past that's happened with some technical things, but not in this day and age. So there will be significant coordination and outreach. It just has not occurred at this point yet. Next slide. So what do we need Wisconsin for? So they are in kind of the same boat. Their method is dated. I think it actually predates MNRAM. It's been changed a little bit over time, but essentially it's the same method. So they have a similar motivation. There were quite a few people over there with experience and quite a bit of knowledge over there, and they bring a different perspective. And certainly having some of those experts helps us sort of lift the load and get this done. Next slide. So how are we going to do it? Again, I mentioned the steering committee. So the steering committee is 4 folks from Wisconsin, all from Wisconsin DNR, and then the 4 that I mentioned before from Minnesota. Again, the intent is, we would have sort of these technical groups, as I call them, to work on different aspects, say water quality, wildlife habitat, that sort of thing. Then there'll be some peer review, and then a big part of what we hope to get is a EPA program development grant. So these are grants that the EPA gives out every 2 years. They go to states to help improve their wetland program. And I think we've received 4 in the last 4 or 5 years. So we've been pretty successful at getting those grants, and they're fairly substantial. There is a 25% match on those that we have to provide, but otherwise, the bulk of the grant we expect would go toward a request for proposals and hiring consultants to help us sort of develop and finalize the product. Most of the newer wetland functional assessment tools are a little more sophisticated than just an Excel spreadsheet. They're web-based and that sort of thing. So we feel like we need to have that aspect of it contracted out, plus just organizing and making sure that the tasks are fulfilled is going to be a big part of the consultant, and also looking up research and stuff like that, just because as state agency folks, we're kind of pulled in different ways and we still have to run our program. So we think talking with Wisconsin DNR that we'll need to hire someone to help. Next slide. So when are we going to be done? That's a good question. Not for sure, but we have mapped out sort of a tentative schedule. Right now we are having steering committee meetings. We've had 2. We're going to have one again next week. Right now those are primarily consisting of looking at other methods that are out there, some of the newer ones, some that were recommended that we look at by EPA. And so we've been combing through those, trying to figure out what we want to use and what we don't want to use. We are also starting to prepare the grant application, and that would presumably come out in 2021. Then if we are awarded the grant, which we think we have a good chance, that would come out late summer 2021. Try to get requests for proposals out and hire a consultant in the fall. And depending on the timeline we work out, anywhere from 2022 to 2023 would start producing some products. That's really all I had on the initiative. I can just go right into rulemaking. Maybe I could go right through these three topics, and then we'll have questions at the end here. Wetland Conservation Act rulemaking update. I spent a lot of time on this a year plus ago on the update. I'm not going to spend as much time because, well, for one thing, there's not a ton to update you on because not a lot has happened. But I'll just kind of go through the timeline. Next slide. So in 2009, we had new rule. Then, 2 short years after that, there were some statute changes in 2011. That coincided with the suspension of rulemakings. State agencies, for the most part, were prohibited from doing any rulemaking. So that put a hold on that. And then in 2012, there were further statute changes. Next slide. And in 2015, more statute changes. And this was about the time the ban on rulemaking, or the restriction, was lifted. And then at that same time, 2015 was a busy year, you can see. There was an executive order to produce a legislative report on wetlands and wetland regulations and provide recommendations. There was stakeholder meetings, and a report was written. So we spent a lot of time on that. At the same time, we were initiating rulemaking, and we had a notice in the state register. And at the same time, we're completing that report, which was finished and submitted to the legislature in 2016. Next slide. Then, no sooner did we get that report submitted, then there was a session law for requiring us to produce a 404 assumption report. So immediately our resources shifted to producing this report. It had a very quick timeline, and that report was completed in 2017, and then lo and behold, in 2017, more statute changes. Next slide. And at the same time, there was a follow-up to the 404 assumption feasibility report. It was an additional exercise to look at what waters were assumable by the state. So we again shifted resources to that. At the same time, we had a series of technical review group meetings, and these were folks from SWCDs and LGUs and consultants that we met throughout the summer of 2018, provided some different rule proposals and got a lot of good feedback. And so we were I thought we were making good progress on rulemaking. And then in 2019, there was further legislation which directed us and DNR and PCA to begin preparing the application for 404 assumption. So again, a shift of resources at Bowser. Rulemaking has pretty much been on hold, and now with the new administration, the Walz administration, we were planning on restarting the stakeholder process, but in order to do that, you do need the approval of the governor's office. So about the time we intended to do that, COVID hit, and so there was really nothing but COVID was the focus of everything that the governor's focus was. So we did not make any progress until just recently. We did finally get approval from the governor's office to, I would just characterize it as restarting the rulemaking process. So we're right now trying to figure out how we're going to restart that. We're certainly going to publish a new request for comments in the state register and start with stakeholder coordination. Don't know exactly what that's going to be yet. Again, there is some apprehension, I guess, about stakeholder coordination given that we can't meet in person, which could be an issue for folks. So stay tuned for that. I mean, we will be very public about when that process starts and when that notice is published. But presumably we get back to somewhat normal here in 2021. We can get through that stakeholder process and have the more formal hearings in 2022. And then there's a number of hurdles to get through the legislature and the governor's office and MMB, Minnesota Management and Budget Office, etc. So the new rule at best would be 2023-2024. Just as a side note, there is a rulemaking manual for the state, and that was recently, I guess a few years ago, updated based on new legislation. So there are a number of sort of procedural requirements that were added that just really results in lengthening the rulemaking process. So not much we can do about that. It just is what it is. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to go over all the statute changes and some of the thoughts because I spent a lot of time doing that last year, but I did count them up. There are 39 separate changes to statutes, including new statutes that we're going to have to incorporate in rule, and some of those are pretty extensive. So this is not going to be a simple and quick rulemaking process. Next slide. So for the time being, we still have the WCA rule. You have your rule book, and then if you haven't been here on our website, under wetland regulation, we do have all the statute changes and then an explanation of which of those is in effect and which needs rulemaking before they're in effect. So essentially, these documents plus the rule book are kind of the WCA rule as it stands right now. Next slide. That's the update on rulemaking. 404 assumptions. Again, I think I spent a fair amount of time on this last year. I'll do a somewhat abbreviated update now. Next slide. First, just for those not familiar, what is 404 assumption? It's kind of a misnomer. We're not actually, or we would not be assuming the program from the Corps. What we would have is we would demonstrate to EPA that we have a state program that is equivalent to the protections provided by the 404 program, or at least as restrictive. And a reminder that it would not cover all the waters and wetlands. The Corps would retain 404 regulatory authority over waters used for interstate commerce. Next slide. And those waters are shown here, basically the major river systems and a couple of the larger lakes, and any wetlands or waters 300 feet out. So that's the current map of the waters and wetlands that we retained by the Corps if Minnesota were to assume 404. Next slide. So why are we doing this? This is outlined in the feasibility report, but basically for quicker regulatory decisions, reduced redundancy, and probably the biggest reason that at least Bowser's doing it, and DNR and PCA, is that we have been directed to do so by the legislature. Next slide. So I'm going to just quickly talk about the requirements for assumption, and this is just, there's a lot more to it than this, but there's just broadly in general, we need EPA approval. We also have to have a MOA, or Memorandum of Agreement, with the Corps. That agreement is not really regarding assumption, it's agreement more related to, for example, if there's a project that impacts both a water that's retained by the Corps plus one that's now under the state program, how are we going to handle that? So all those kinds of details have to be worked out in an agreement with the Corps. Next slide. We also need a letter from the governor. So there has to be support from the governor's office if Minnesota is to move forward. We also need Attorney General support. They need to have a statement of authority. Next slide. So where are we at now? We have completed a draft of one of the more tedious tasks, which is a comparison of the state program with federal requirements. And we have a draft that's currently being reviewed by EPA, and this is not just WCA, even though WCA is the biggest part of it. It is the DNR Protected Public Waters Program and also Pollution Control Agency 401 program. So we do have that draft. We have identified a potential implementation model that we're now discussing with EPA. We did have a report due to the legislature in February of this year, but because of COVID, again, everything got pushed back. There was not the stakeholder coordination, did not occur, other than I think one virtual online thing that was not attended very well. So request to extend that, I believe there's legislation introduced right now to extend it an additional year. So what we're probably looking at is a report to the legislature on what changes are needed to state law in order to allow the state to assume 404, and that would be in February of next year, depending on, I guess, ultimately what the legislation is. But if it's a year as requested, then it would be February of 2022. We will need to draft an application and, of course, work with the Corps on a memorandum of agreement. Next slide. So what have we found out thus far? We have a pretty clear indication from EPA that the current WCA structure, where the LGUs make all the decisions, is not going to be acceptable under an assumed program. So the decisions have to be made by the state. However, it appears that LGUs will be able to verify compliance with general permits issued by the state. And I'll explain a little bit more here in a couple slides about that particular item. Next slide. We've also found out that we only need to meet federal requirements associated with basically the discharge of dredged fill material. So WCA obviously regulates excavation and drainage as well. Since that is outside the scope of the federal assumption requirements, that part of WCA does not need to meet any of the federal requirements. And we've also determined that we certainly will have to incorporate some form of water quality certification in order to meet federal requirements, and that's the 401 certification right now the PCA does through the Corps permit. They don't certify a lot of the projects they've done. They've certified the general permits to allow those projects to be water quality certified without an individual review, but they do a couple dozen of those a year. So right now that their rules are all about how to do that, or they instruct them to do that through the federal program. So we would have to make some changes to have that now done through a state program. Next slide. So possible implementation structure, we're looking at the state, or Bowser in particular, when it comes to WCA, issuing a series of general permits. And of course, if you've worked with the Corps, you know they have general permits for certain activities. We would issue the same. Those general permits would be structured to sort of emulate the WCA exemptions and no loss provisions, at least in part. And what we envision anyway is that the general permits would require applicants to obtain a WCA LGU approval if the notification threshold is exceeded, which would serve as verification of compliance with the general permit. So for the vast majority of projects out there, they would still follow the same WCA process. It's just that there's this general permit out there with a certain threshold. So if the project proposer goes in, applies to get a WCA approval, depending on the activity, that would serve as confirmation that they're eligible for that general permit. Next slide. So I tried to diagram this out, very simplified diagram, but basically picture up in the upper left there, there's different activity-based general permits, say agricultural, transportation, maintenance, repair, etc. And then each of those would have a notification threshold. So probably the simplest, let's take de minimis exemption. Say your project has an applicable de minimis of say 2,000 square feet. So if your project is under 2,000 square feet, it falls under the maintenance repair GP, then you wouldn't have to apply to the LGU. You just qualify for the general permit. And that works just like WAC is now, right? If you have a de minimis exemption, you don't necessarily have to apply. But obviously, it's a good idea to do that, and a lot of folks do that, which is good. But it would work the same way here. And then if the notification threshold was exceeded, so say you have greater than 2,000 square feet in my example here, then you would have to apply to the LGU for approval of a replacement plan. You get that approval, as long as it's below the overall threshold for that general permit, then that is you're in compliance with the general permit. You can move on. What is the general permit threshold? Well, that is something that we have to work out with EPA, but say it's 2 acres. So if your impact's above the de minimis, but less than 2 acres, you go to the LGU just like you do now, get your approval, you're done. And if you're above whatever that threshold turns out to be, say it's 0.5 acres, then they'd have to go to an individual permit, and the individual permit would be a Bowser decision. Next slide. So, again, a little repetitive here, but the notification threshold would coincide with the WAC exemptions. We'd have these GP thresholds, and the individual permit. So again, that would be something that Bowser would have to do. What we would propose and what we envision is that decision process would work the same as it does now with LGUs, only in this case it'd be Bowser. We'd have a TEP, there'd be recommendations, we'd do the same sort of noticing procedures that LGUs do. There is a possibility that we could ask for or require further LGU input than just participation on the TEP, particularly those LGUs that have land use and zoning authority. They could essentially have to sort of write off on that approval as well to make sure that it's compatible with those land use and zoning. Again, these are just speculation at this point, but these are things that we are discussing with EPA, and so I'm sharing those now. No decisions have been made, but that's the way we're headed at this point. There is sort of this messy situation with the local road program where we have banks that are essentially being built and proposed by us. So it'd be Bowser approving the banks. So we have talked to EPA about that. They suggested a separate sort of oversight panel. So we would work with them on that as well. So for those cases where Bowser is the applicant, which I can only think of would be for the local road program banks, we have this separate oversight board. Next slide. Okay, so that was my 404 assumption update, and I just got a couple slides here on our WCA topics of the week. Next slide. So hopefully all of you have been able to take a look at least some of these. I send those out. We were sending them out every 2 weeks, I believe, during the COVID summer, and then we started to slow down here in fall and winter. There should be one coming out here in February in a week or two. I think the last one was in November. These have been pretty popular. I've got some good feedback from folks on it's. These are not formal guidance, but they're just sort of informal papers that describe particular aspects of WCA and application of the WCA rule. Next slide. And here's just an example of one. We're trying to keep those to 2 pages. Some of them have an appendix for this. Oh, and it's usually in a question and answer format. They've all been in a question and answer format. In this one, the appendix is an illustration. Next slide. And some of them have like a checklist. So you can see the one on the left is the WCA sequencing checklist, which is hopefully better than the old one that we had years ago. We did one on the drainage exemption, which is a very complicated exemption. This took quite some time, but it's sort of a yes/no worksheet that one can work through to see if a particular project is eligible for the WCA drainage exemption. So hopefully people are taking advantage of some of these appendices and just the overall WCA topics of the week. But I believe somebody is distributing that to the WPA membership, I hope. And I know that a lot of you are either on the LGU list or are consultants for LGUs, and you're receiving those as well. So, and we're always open to suggestions on topics. I've gotten a few suggestions, and we had to draft those and get those out as well. So you can always email me with suggested topics. I would advise kind of looking through at least some of them so you can see sort of how they approach it. But we are limited in we're trying to stick to that 2-page limit. So there's only so much detail we could go into. That's all I had. Next slide.
For questions, we have one for why not use the hydrogeomorphic model, I think going back to the MinRAM update.
Yep, we'll be incorporating the HGM classification system into functional assessment. So that's one of the priorities that we've already worked out as we go through functional assessment, the way we're going to approach it with working with the folks in Wisconsin. So yeah, HGM is definitely going to be the way to go.
We had a comment on fees and in lieu of fees. I'm not exactly sure what that pertains to. But another question, what happens to the 404 assumption if the definition of the waters of the U.S. is reverted back to what it was?
I don't think it would, well, I guess you never know what if it's reverted back, it wouldn't have any material effect on Minnesota's efforts. We already regulate more waters than either rule, so we're already more restrictive. There are a few waters, there's a couple gaps in our regulation that we're going to have to close no matter what rule is in place. Those are primarily like headwater stream areas. But for the most part, it really wouldn't change anything to do with at least our state, just because we have this more encompassing regulation.
And then if 404 were assumed, would there be any changes to WCA enforcement violation procedures?
Remains to be seen. From what I read and kind of worked through on our documents we've drafted, our enforcement procedures are not entirely consistent with the requirements of the federal statutes on 404 assumption. However, I think one could argue that they are roughly equivalent. So a lot of areas like that. So that's the hard work, I guess, where we have to coordinate and discuss with EPA about what changes will be made. So if I had to guess, I would imagine there would be some tweaks to the enforcement process, but nothing major.
Okay. Going back to that fee, we have Bowser would have to figure out how to deal with approving its own banks as well as the in lieu fee program in its site. Comment, I don't know. Want to And then
Yeah.
are there any updates on the status of an in lieu fee program for Minnesota?
But we didn't include a update on the in lieu fee, but yes, some part of the in lieu fee program, or a big part of it, is to have these large prioritization plans for wetland mitigation, and they're called CPFs, or comprehensive planning framework.
Frameworks. Yeah, I can give a little bit of update on that, Ken.
Yeah.
All right, so right now we're doing CPFs for each BSA. And we have BSA 6 done, and we have BSA 7 done. And we are working on BSA 5. We're putting out an RFP for people to complete that CPF for us. Now, the in lieu fee program, it comes in two parts. You've got the CPFs, and then you have the instrument. We are still working on the instrument, but the CPFs can continue. So we're still making progress. It's just, you know, we're working with the Corps, and things take time.
Yeah, and under assumption, that is one of the major questions that we pose to EPA, is how do we administer an in lieu fee program that's sponsored by the state when, you know, we've assumed 404, for example, and they don't have an answer yet. So that is one of the big things that we're trying to figure out in the process. Now they were in rulemaking and that was one of the things that EPA was going to, they had engaged in rulemaking that was one of the big issues. It's like, well, what if a state has an in lieu fee program and they assume what's going to happen there? And I don't know if that got stalled or what. I mean, they were shifted around and prioritized to different things. So remains to be seen. I don't know what the answer is, but it's going to be significant. Now, I didn't mention, but you might have heard the news that Florida became the third state to assume the 404 program, and that was just approved. So it's like, well, what are they doing? Well, in their 404 assumption, they did not assume wetland banking. They left that to the Army Corps. And so we don't really have a model to follow with Florida because they just punted on the whole banking thing and allowed the Corps to do it. In their case, Florida has the Corps district down there has folks that are dedicated solely to banking. So they have a pretty robust banking program out there that I think the state just felt like that it was working good and they didn't really need to do it. So
another question. With 404 assumption and presumably WCA rule revision, will there be an effort to repeal MPCA rules, example MR 7D50.0186, to eliminate redundant agency rules for replacement?
I don't know the answer to that yet. I mean, these are things that have not been worked out yet. First of all, we got to sort of figure out what water quality certification rules we need to incorporate in an assumed program. And then, you know, in terms of the mitigation requirement, that's something that we have to discuss both with MPCA and EPA to figure out, you know, how that's going to work. You know, obviously, at least in my opinion, you know, having the same mitigation requirements would be the goal. But, you know, I don't get to determine that alone. So I guess we'll see.
Will Bowser abide by the mitigation hierarchy when credits are available in these BSAs where the ILF operates?
I assume mitigation hierarchy is the being referred to as in the federal mitigation rule. So we'll have to abide by the federal mitigation rule hierarchy under an assumed program. I do believe there is some nuance to that and how each district conforms to the the hierarchy, but I frankly haven't thought about it in detail yet. But we are subject to the federal mitigation rule to a certain extent, so we have to show equivalency. So I would, my best answer at this point is yeah.
Okay, that looks like to be the end of the questions for that. Earlier on during that, there was a question on acronyms used. David, you mentioned, replied back in the chat. Could you real quick just update everyone?
Yeah, sure. So the question was, which acronym should we use, for describing us as certified wetland delineators? And the response that I gave to what we're recommending folks to use CMWP. That stands for Certified Minnesota Wetland Professional.
Great. And then we have one more question now. Can Dennis comment on how the state determines purchase price / value for the option number 1 easement sign up?
Let me see if I understand this question. How we determine the purchase price value for option the easement. Okay, so for the easement sign up, we pay the landowner or the easement grantor a predetermined payment per acre, which is based off rim rates. So when we evaluate all these options, the cost per credit will take that into effect, and then cost per credit or the cost for construction and implementation and so forth. Does that answer the question?
Dennis, well, just to clarify, RIM is Reinvest in Minnesota, so that's the conservation program, and they have rates, and those are based primarily on land values.
Yes, from the question asker, that it is answered. And that's all the questions I have at this current moment. Is that the end of the presentation?
I think that's all we had.
Okay. Colleen, would you like to?
I don't have much to wrap it up here, but I'll just say thanks everyone for tuning in. And if there's any questions, you can follow up with the speaker today, or send us questions for the board members. And we are working on next month's forum, which will be on March 3rd, I think it is. And we'll be sending out details as soon as we have them available. So stay tuned. And thanks everyone for attending today.